Welcome to The Independent Artist, sponsored by the National Association of Independent Artists, NAIA. I'm Douglas Sigworth. I'm a glassblower.
I'm Will Armstrong, mixed media artist. Join us as we explore the topics that affect the lives and livelihood of art show artists.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Will, how's it going with you today?
It's going well with me, Douglas. It's nice to see you again. Nice to hear your voice.
You too.
Yeah.
So we record these a few days before the episodes air. So sometimes we either catch something too soon or too late, and things have changed.
You might hear us talking about Winter Park 2 or 3 weeks after the fact, but this isn't a news podcast. We're trying to produce this on a fairly professional level, but you do have news, right?
I do have news. Just got an email from Ann Arbor. We had talked about a few weeks ago that we thought that they had canceled too soon, right before the whole CDC announcement came out. And this week we find that they're considering reversing course. By the time this comes out next Monday, this will probably be old news, but it looks like Ann Arbor is going to happen, and it's going to change to 3 days instead of 4. Whoever thought that would happen?
Wow, that's impressive. That's the thing about Ann Arbor is that you always seem to go to that show and set up shop. Feels like you're there for a whole week.
Right.
I just kind of applaud those guys for adapting and rolling with it and kind of pivoting like we all have this past year. I know they're probably going to take some flack for being wishy-washy, but I don't look at it that way. I look at it like them adapting to the times. This is a crazy time and they're trying to figure out how to go forward. So way to go.
I have no idea what goes into the planning for an event that huge. And I can just imagine once they made the call and then to say, well, should we change our minds? There's just too many things to turn back. It might have been easier just to say, let's just leave it as is. But they did make the hard call and looked into it and it looks like are going to do it.
Good. I mean, the city had to be scrambling too. It brings so many people in from out of town. It brings the community out. The dollars spent in restaurants and bars and everything else. The whole community had to have been kind of clamoring to bring it back. Something that big. How many shows are there?
I honestly don't know. But the thing about what's changed too is South University got taken over by the Guild, I believe it is. So it's like there's merging and combining going on. The other thing that it said in the email is the amount of exhibitors that they can invite is going to go down. So that'll be interesting. I mean, Ann Arbor has been criticized for years for being too many exhibitors and too many days. So that might be two big concerns taken care of in one fell swoop.
So are you telling me that Ann Arbor's just going to get a big enema? Like having a washout here? It sounds like a restart. I'm all for it. So anything to improve our industry. People have talked about enjoying that extra space around the booths at some of these other shows that have gone forward and enjoying that extra. Everybody almost seems like they're having a corner. People enjoy it. It is going to come with a backlash. People are like, oh, I enjoy all the extra space. And you're like, oh, do you enjoy your chances of participating going from, 75% chance of participating down to a 55? Your schedule is going to be a little bit harder to do. I like my odds anyway, because I'm a cocky guy, but man, that is hard to deal with when you think about the smaller shows. Some of your friends aren't going to be there anymore. So anyway, I do think the whole industry needs a little bit of a change. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Ann Arbor and going forward with a lot of these shows.
I, for one, I'm going to say on the record, I do not mind with the price points that we sell at having a $100 booth fee bump to have fewer exhibitors. So yes.
Okay. Wait a minute, though. I'm going to go back on you on that. Like when you go back to what Stephen King said and the lower percentage point of what they're actually using our booth fees for, I think shows probably ought to try to be a little bit more creative in getting funding as far as that goes. I don't want it to pass on to us.
I understand where you're coming from there. Some of the shows, the booth fee budgets are small in comparison to their overall budget, and they do have other sources of funding. But that's Des Moines. And there are other shows that don't operate under that kind of a threshold. For example, Krazel years ago, I remember having this conversation with Sarah Schomburger, that they made a shift at one point where they tightened up the amount of exhibitors and bumped the booth fee a little bit, and that was a successful shift. People were happy to have less competition and were willing to bump in $50 booth fee or whatever extra to cover those costs. So that's just where I'm at in this issue.
It's a theory. I just don't want pitchforks in front of your house, Douglas.
Okay, thanks for protecting me, Will.
I got you. All right. I just don't want to see that happening. Like, what do you mean bump the booth fees?
We're coming for you, Sigworth.
They are. So you're talking about changes and pivots and things. Here's one that did cancel. Sausalito had to cancel because of a crazy situation out there in the parks.
What I know from talking to Kathleen, I've been keeping in touch with her as soon as the information came out when they said, congratulations, you're accepted, and we're moving the show to Dunphy Park. And I went online thinking, isn't that where we parked our trailers in that dust hole at the end of the show? Really? That's where we're going to do this? And I went online and I saw all of the other artists commenting, that's not going to work. What are they thinking? So, a lot of us reached out to her, and her response was that this was coming from the city. The city was trying to move this unfortunate, huge amount of homeless that have occurred since COVID, and they've taken up residence in Dunphy Park. And the city, which is not the show, it's the city, are trying to get them out of this visible spot at the heart of downtown Sausalito into a more private, secluded area, which happened to be Martinship Park, and that just put the show at odds with what the city wanted. So unfortunately, it really messed with what was going on for Sausalito Art Show.
I think that more and more we are learning about things that happen to shows are more because of what's coming down the pike from the city as opposed to what the shows want to do. So it's important to stay empathetic to everybody on all sides of the coin, but it's a bummer that they're going to go, 2 years in a row without a Sausalito?
So let's hope that they keep the ball rolling next year, but if not, that'll be devastating because that was a top-tier show.
It was. At one point, it really was. And many people have tried to rescue that show and change it. But let's put our faith in somebody that has a track record like Kathleen Hughes. Mm-hmm. So good luck to Sausalito. Sorry that happened to them.
Hey, Will, so there have been a couple weeks now that you've brought up the issue of you never like to say no to a customer. And I thought that was really interesting, the whole idea of how we as artists interact with our collectors and how we make the sale. How do you take somebody who's mildly interested or they're kind of on the maybe stage? How do you keep from saying no, and how do you turn those maybes into a yes?
That's a long topic, Douglas. I can tell you about my no. I treat the no word kind of like I do the F word with my kids. I just try not to say it.
Yeah, right.
I just don't want to say it. But, changing a maybe into a yes, a lot of that for me is just prolonging the conversation.
Yeah.
This is part of my jurying process because my work at the beginning of this body of work looked so much like woodblock that when they'd come in and they'd say, is this woodblock? I'd say, no. And they're like, oh, huh. And be like, instead of saying that, be like, yes, it does look a lot like woodblock. It's all hand drawn. I'm using ink and kind of a comic book creating drawing method. So as my work has changed, I've changed the process a little bit. It's now more mixed media. Anyway, that's beside the point.
I try and take that whole bonding moment as well. So I will oftentimes pick up the piece and hand it to them and let them hold it because they might have that initial fear. Obviously, if they're too afraid to take ownership of it, I won't hand it to them. But if they are holding it, they can actually have control over turning and looking and bonding and holding it out in the sun and increasing that ability for somebody to connect with your work and connect with our story. That is very effective for me.
Yeah, it's all about opening yourself up to the sale and opening yourself up to, they want the personal experience if they're at the art show. So you're trying to be likable. I don't want to be sitting there looking at my phone. I want to just kind of, I talked to Clifton a little bit about this. I want to be open. I want to be open to the people. They want a little piece of me. So if I'm being an asshole that day, then I've got to change course.
Totally.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, you can really get in your own way that way.
If I've had a really bad phone conversation, if this is upsetting me, I have to change that and I have to be a more likable person. And it a lot of times will happen where like the husband likes me and the wife doesn't, or the wife likes me and the husband doesn't. You got to get the other person on board. I don't want to lock them into the booth, but I also want to keep them there as long as possible to try to find that common ground.
I have a funny story about that. So I was at a show once and husband walks in the booth. The husband and wife had been looking at our work the day before and they were a classic B-back. I'm thinking, great. The guy walks in and he says, hey, remember that piece we were talking about yesterday? Can you grab that? I really want to see it again. Awesome. So I dipped behind my booth. I had actually set it aside because it was one of those that I thought was super serious and they might come back. So I wanted to kind of get it out of view from other people. I move around the back of my booth. I start digging through the bins and the wife walks into the booth and she doesn't know that I'm in the back. She says to him, what are we doing? And he says, oh, I'm having him grab that piece. And she goes, what? I didn't want that piece. And I'm standing back there like, do I just hide? Do I let them leave? And they're still talking. And so I just peek my head around the wall and I say, did you still want me to look for that piece?
That reminds me of the story I did. I became friends with Signe and Gena Grusterfinko. They were my neighbors at a show in Texas one year. And we call this one my screw you sale.
Okay.
Because this couple comes in. I'd had a mediocre show all weekend, and this couple comes in and they're looking at a big one. You know, it's like a $3,800 painting, and they could clearly come back for it. And the guy goes, he's like, well, you know, the classic, any end of show deals? And I'm like,
right.
You know, and I'm like, I know a lot of people don't do this. I'm like, well, I'm here. You're here. Let's talk. What are you thinking?
Right.
And he's like, I don't know, $500. And I went, screw you, buddy. And I turned around and I kept packing up because it was 5:30. The show closed at 5, and I'm back in the back and I'm packing my stuff up. And I'm not going to sell a $3,800 piece for $500.
Right.
And so I'm back there. I'm packing.
It's not even remotely serious. That's like a.
And just as I'm putting my headphones back in to have my pack up music back in my ears to keep me going, I hear his wife say, I can't believe you did that. I am so mad at you. And she was livid. And he was like, I'm sorry. You know, he was open to a deal. Like, I just wanted to see how low he'd go. She's like, that is insulting.
That is insulting.
You made him mad. And I'm like, I'm back there just laughing. And I'm like, I go back around. I'm like, I'm not discounting this goddamn thing a dime.
No, in fact, you're hoping she adds $500 to the tab.
Oh yeah, and he's like, "Well, what kind of deal can you give me?" And I was like, "Honestly, I'm really firm on this piece. It's one of my favorite pieces. I'm really excited about showing it at the next show."
Yeah.
And I got cash.
There you go.
I didn't give him a thing, so we call that one the screw you sale. So you never really know.
I love it. I love that. That is great.
So obviously, Douglas, I am clearly, as you've known, a very reactive person.
Really? I hadn't noticed.
So I get myself in a little bit of trouble. You know, people, this is why I was never good at debate. In high school, the debate class would be like, somebody would say something. I'm like, well, F you.
Screw you, man.
Yeah, I'm done. Man, Douglas, if Marshall and Vanderhart was the kick in the butt we all needed, Chris Dahlquist is the soothing voice of a good therapist. I just really enjoyed your conversation.
Yeah.
I felt like at some points when I was listening to this talk that I'm sitting on the couch and I'm like, and then they said this to me. And she's like, I know, it's okay. You know, I just feel like she's a really incredible. I think she refers to herself as a counselor at some point, as like an art show counselor almost.
She put me at ease. She brought up things that I had never even really thought about before.
She does. She gets into the whole idea of lifting each other up, which I think is huge too. I think a lot of times in our industry, we look at our fellow artists as the competition. I try to look at it as, you know, they are our tribe.
Yeah.
Even artists that are our competition, like specifically, you know, they're going between A and B. I always try to congratulate the person on the sale. It's almost like in advertising. When you look at advertising, I remember taking a class in college about how radio advertising is not necessarily important to make people make the sale. It's more to make yourself feel good if you have already bought. Nobody's going to hear the advertisement on the radio about the latest car and, I better go get that car. But if you have bought that car, you're going to feel better about it because of the ad. And you're like, damn right, I'm driving the new.
Well, Well, even the issue of competition, there is that inherent insecurity that we all feel. Not so much that, we're not going to be able to make sales, but that feeling of, is our work being appreciated and loved? And working in this community, having each other's back and really embracing each other's process, that builds us all up and it creates a marketplace for all of us. It doesn't matter what the tastes that a collector has, it's building a marketplace for all of us artists.
Yeah, and when somebody walks into a booth with a piece of artwork, I always try to take a peek at it and be like, hey, what'd you get?
Yeah, cool.
You know, like, oh man, you know, like what a great buy. I know her work. She's amazing. This person, and if you have something about that, it makes them feel better about the whole show. You know, I'm not going to look at their piece and be like, oh, that's a piece of shit. Why'd you buy that? You know, why'd you buy from me? You know, it's like, and it makes them feel better. You know, if somebody, I remember this really clearly, an example of this, like somebody walked in with a huge Amanda Bennett and I'm like, oh my God, she's awesome. We just had dinner last night. You know, she and Carrie and I just went out and we blah, blah, blah. These people are great. It makes them feel better about their purchase. It makes them feel better about the show.
And these collectors aren't just buying one time. They're habitual art buyers. So if we're not selling that weekend, you know, if we're on their radar, it will happen at some point. So really just lifting each other up is good for everybody.
Yeah, man, how many times have you gone into a home and to deliver a piece and you see 3, 4, 5 different friends of yours on the walls?
Absolutely.
It's a great feeling.
It's fun to see whose work gels with your own work. And you're like, okay, so you get in the head of that collector and you know what really gets them excited.
What they're after. Hey, speaking of building each other up, I mentioned a couple of photographers last week as far as being the award-winning ones. And I didn't want that to turn into a whole Oscar speech. Be like, I'd like to recognize this person, that person, this person. But it's like, I love photography. I love the medium. And I love what goes into it. I think photographers a lot of times beat themselves up because it takes, 10,000 images to get 2 good ones.
Oh, yeah. It's like glass blowers, too. That's the same thing with multiple attempts to get the superstar. But anyway, go right ahead.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of jealousy for photographers sometimes, or like they think that it's just a click.
Oh, man.
Like, you just took a click and it's click and print. And it's so much more than that.
It is.
In order to, talking to Clifton about mapping out his ideas when he's in the studio, it's not easy for Chris Dahlquist to capture that soothing energy that she does from the images that she gets from the planes.
I love it.
I have a lot of respect for photography and how much it goes into trying to capture that image and try to say what you're saying. I'm good friends with Greg Turco. I know how much he beats himself up over a new image. It's amazing to see when it finally comes out, when you're finally able to put that new image out and put it on the wall and show it to the public. There's a lot of pressure there.
That's what I love about this podcast. Will, we really get the behind the scenes of different mediums that we're not exposed to or different artists. And I love hearing about the process and what motivates them and gets them going. And I really love that we're going to, keep going with this. And just a little bit of business to share with everybody is we've been going weekly, and now Will and I are going to be back to shows, which we're super happy about and jazzed about. But just for scheduling, we're going to be doing the episode releases 2 a month now. So it'll be every other week. You can look for new releases in your podcast streaming services.
You sent me a text this morning and told me you wanted to go bi-weekly, and I'm not going to lie to you. I looked up bi-weekly, and that could mean 2 a week, or it could mean every other. And I was like, you better not be. I know how excited you are, Douglas, but we're not going to 2 a week.
I did laugh when you said twice a week, and I'm like, every other week.
Yeah, I'm trying. My wife is trying to teach me to be less reactive, so I like to try to gather all of the information that I have available to me before I react to it. So
I didn't get a WTF text back, right?
Yeah, I've got shows coming up bi-weekly, and this thing isn't paying the bills. We do appreciate the people that have donated.
A quick shout out to this week's contributors, David Bierstrom and Bonnie Blanford and Sarah Collier. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And if you would like to contribute, you can do so through Venmo at Independent Artist Podcast or by clicking on the PayPal link connected to our episode notes.
very generous benefactors that have helped us keep the wheels on the wagon and help us to host this thing. All of that stuff that goes on with it. It takes quite a bit of money that we've just been going out of pocket. So we appreciate that.
Hey, Will, I know everybody would just love to keep listening to us go back and forth all day long here, but Chris Dahlquist's interview is waiting.
I think they could, Douglas. They don't want to. Trust me, she's a lot more interesting than we are.
So, okay, here we are, everyone. Chris Dahlquist coming up next. Our guest today on the Independent Artist Podcast is Chris Dahlquist. Chris has exhibited extensively throughout the United States, and her work can be found in hundreds of private, corporate, and municipal collections. In addition to her artwork, Chris has built a civic practice of helping other artists build sustainable careers. She has worked with hundreds of individual artists of all disciplines to develop strategies and business skills to support their practices. Chris advocates that the individual artist must be at the center of any arts ecosystem. She works with municipalities, arts organizations, and businesses to develop strategies, programs, and policies to support the individual artist within the larger community. In 2016, Dahlquist partnered with Kansas City, Missouri, the Kansas City Economic Development Council, and AltCap, Alternative Capital for Community Impact, to develop and launch the first artist-centered micro-lending program in the country. Renee and I had the good fortune of meeting Chris and her husband, Kyle, when we were booth neighbors at the Kansas City Plaza Art Fair several years ago. She is a beloved member of this artist community and a staunch advocate for our industry. She's an incredibly busy individual, and I'm thrilled that she's given us some of her valuable time here today. Well, Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Now, you are an accomplished artist, winning countless awards and juring into the nation's top art shows and festivals. We could do an entire podcast talking to you about your amazing work. But today I've asked you here to discuss a topic that scares a lot of us professional artists. That's the topic of running our art businesses. Now, you've said that being raised by a preacher and a CPA has influenced you to be a passionate pragmatist regarding your career mentoring. Can you tell me a little more about what that means to you?
Sure. So I think it actually extends beyond my career mentoring, and really it's my whole life I experienced as a passionate pragmatist. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, I could talk for an hour about how it's influenced my sense of community and all of these things being raised in that way. But at the end of the day, it's about being simultaneously so passionate about something that it's the center of my life, which is my artwork, but also always keeping my eye on the bottom line and making sure that it is sustainable, right? So, so that's the CPA influence, and then from the preacher influence is this being so passionate about something, regardless of the financial outcome.
Okay. Well, I know that in your teaching, you talk about the difference between being proactive and reactive. Can we maybe start there?
I've been working with artists for about a dozen years now, building sustainable practices. And the one thing that they all have in common, all of the ones that have successful and sustainable careers, is that they're very proactive about creating that career for themselves. I concentrate a lot on goal setting and defining the path that you want to go as an artist. That's absolutely has to be the place you start with a proactive career. Artists tend to work really reactively, and it kind of stands to reason because when we're in our studio, we're often working reactively.
How so?
Well, as a glass artist, my guess is that you're reacting and you're responding to the glass as it's giving you feedback, right? Or as a painter, you're reacting to the last mark that you made on the canvas, right? It's this process of reacting oftentimes to the last thing that you've done or to your materials.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
As opposed to kind of wrestling the materials you're working in concert with them.
Right. In the creating of our work, we start with a plan, a goal of what we're doing. We react to the evolution of the piece. But now when it comes to the business side of it, we need to be a little bit more of a planner and look at the end game. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. In fact, the way you've laid it out in terms of the way we might work as an artist is very much the way we should work with our career. To have that end goal, to have a vision of where we want to go, and then begin mapping the course from here to there. And a lot of times it's just about reacting to an opportunity as it comes up. Like, oh, they want me to show here, or this opportunity has come up, without really analyzing it. Does it get me to my goal? Is this going to help me get to that end objective that I have?
Do you find that if we only focus on being reactive, that we don't make ourselves aware to what we actually want to create in front of us? And if you're proactively saying, I want to work in this way, or I want this opportunity to come to me, that we then have our eyes open and see the subtle cues?
100%. Yes, absolutely. There's so much opportunity around us. Once we set the course towards it, it often we'll see it in our environment, that those opportunities are there.
How does an artist or a performer, you work broadly, not just with art show artists, but you work with artists across all different media, performing artists and whatnot. How does an artist sit down and kind of define a business model or an objective or goal for themselves?
You need to start with the end game in mind. At the end of the day, where do you want to be? And so in a lot of the workshops that I do, we start with a very holistic view of where do you want to be. We actually start with, sounds morbid. It is not meant to be morbid. It's meant to really define our values. We start with writing a eulogy for ourselves.
Meaning,
like at the end of your life, what do you want
to
have accomplished? Right? What do you want people to say about you, and what do you want to have accomplished at the end of your life? Like, we start with this very big view. We get so wrapped up in the details of getting to the next show, or packing the van, or making X number of pieces, whatever it is, that we don't take this large view of, at the end of the day, what am I really doing, and what do I want to have been doing? And I think the last year has really given us a reset to step off the hamster wheel for a minute and really think about what and why am I doing this?
I totally relate to what you're saying. The grueling schedules that we set up for ourselves, it becomes really just trying to execute like this amazing race, this Tough Mudder kind of mentality of, I just have to do, this step, without there being a kind of a step back and a thoughtful approach about how we do it and what we're trying to accomplish. And the pandemic has really made us all go, whoa, now what do we do? And kind of reevaluate.
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of a lucky stroke for me. I had always been real intentional with building my practice, or I thought I had been at the beginning. And then I got on the hamster wheel of doing festivals, and I kind of forgot to step out to really consider what I was doing. In 2008, I was working with Polaroids. And in 2008, they stopped manufacturing Polaroid film.
I remember that.
And so I had this same kind of, not to the degree, of course, that we've had this last year, but this real sudden reset of my practice. And in that same spring of 2008, I was fortunate enough to go to a workshop with an organization called Creative Capital that really asked you to dig into why you're doing what you're doing. And it all kind of came to a head with the loss of the film, and that I could really evaluate what and why I was doing it and set a new course for myself.
Right. And expand and grow.
Yeah. So what at first looked like a terrible thing ended up being a really important reset for me. It was painful at the time, right? I was completely panicked. I had no idea. I had shows scheduled and no material to make work that I had juried in with.
Right.
So of course it was terrible at the time, but looking back at it, I can see how instrumental that introspection was. I am hopeful that we'll be able to look back at this time 10 years from now, 12 years from now, and say, oh, that is when I course corrected, or that's when I got on this path.
Right. I can totally relate to the material change kind of thing, because there was a moment when glass was going to have different standards on how it could be created and whatever. And it was looking like our raw materials might be something we couldn't get our hands on. And it was like, what do we do now? But you course correct, you expand, you grow, and you get stronger, and you find a new way to go.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of this story, the story of someone is making Sunday lunch with their mother, and mother cuts the end off the ham and puts it into the oven. And the daughter says, Mom, why do you cut the end off the ham? And Mom says, well, because Grandma cut the end off the ham. I don't know. And
Right.
So she says, well, let's call Grandma and find out, why do we cut the end off the ham? And she calls Grandma, and Grandma says, well, because it didn't fit in my pan, right? So there's this, sometimes we do it just because we've always done it.
Right.
Or we're making this work because we've always made this work. I'm going to this festival because I've always gone to this festival.
Absolutely.
And like, wait a minute, how did that even become a thing?
Right. The size of Grandma's pan doesn't really matter now. It mattered when she made it, but it's an outdated thing, so we can grow.
As long as we stop and ask.
Right.
Ask the question. And so I'm hoping that this is that pause to ask those questions. Like, am I satisfied with what I'm doing? Am I getting where I want to go?
Yeah.
And where do I even want to go?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this has been a rough time. I feel fortunate that we've gotten through a year, and we can still say, yes, we can enter back into the art show market when the shows open up, that we are still in business. And I know there's a lot of our friends who can't say that. So I'm sensitive to that point.
Yes.
But if we've had the luxury to survive through this, it really is an opportunity to reevaluate things and make informed decisions for better choices.
Mm-hmm. And now that we see that something like this could happen,
Mm-hmm.
like who even could have conceived of this? Then I think it's incumbent on us to make some choices so that if we end up in a situation like this, knock on wood, right? That something like this doesn't ever happen, but that we can be in a better position.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is looking at the folks that have made it through, and what were they doing to make it through? What were the things that made it possible?
Cool. Yeah.
That's another place to look in terms of being proactive.
Totally. Right. Take other people's examples, and don't be afraid to ask questions. One of the things I've had to learn along the way is there was a sense of insecurity or pride of feeling like, well, if I don't have all the answers, then it shows a sign of weakness to ask somebody for those answers, or they might not want to share those answers. It still is a point of strength in what you've devoted your life to be open to other ways to do things and better ways to do things.
I love that. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that I've learned through my involvement in a program that I've been with since 2009 is called Artist Inc. And it brings artists together to build their business skills. And I'm a facilitator in that program. And really, it's about sharing with one another, and really this understanding of being vulnerable and asking questions is a sign of strength.
Yeah.
And is how we strengthen our practice. And it's been really illuminating how many artists really don't have any idea how other artists make their living or operate their business. And so one of the biggest things we do in that program is transparency. This is the way I'm doing it.
Right.
A peek behind the curtain, if you will.
Yeah. So that talk about vulnerability, and this is kind of outside the art fair realm, but as a kind of a personal realm, I did a lot of reading and listening to workshops from Brené Brown, and she talks about how when we reveal our vulnerability in a safe environment, you can't just go around being vulnerable to the world, and it's not safe, and you could get, wounded that way. But having a safe space to reveal vulnerability is where true connection happens. So if we are amongst an artist community who holds those values sacred, then it is good to build each other up and to learn better ways to do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that key is that trusted peer community, right? That you know that you can trust with your story. I think that moves all of us forward. Once we define goals for ourselves and understand one another's goals, then we become one another's champions even more, right? And I think it also, when we understand one another's goals and practices, we understand that we're not in competition with one another, that we're actually on completely different tracks. And it's not a zero-sum game. I think that that's one of the things that gets us into the most trouble, or not wanting to share with one another, is this idea that if you succeed, it's going to take away from my success.
Right.
And it's really just the opposite, right? We can all lift each other up. You can see throughout history that artists have succeeded as groups. I mean, if you look at through music, if you look through lots and lots of visual art schools, right? It's groups of artists lifting one another up, and they all succeed.
That's a good point.
And I think there's a lot to be learned from that.
Yeah, maybe some people have the feeling, well, I'm going to an art show and there's a limited amount of people there, and people are coming with a limited budget. And if they buy your work, they're not going to walk into my booth and buy my work. So we maybe operate from a place of competition instead of realizing that as a whole, in the broader sense, we're raising awareness for the importance of art and the importance of artists, and we're creating a market for ourselves that is supported by other artists. So it is an important thing to work on.
I think part of that is also like a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is that we're selling. Like, I think a lot of times when we're in our booth, we think that we're selling an object, and that object is competing with another object that's 3 booths down or whatever. And I fundamentally don't think we're selling objects. I mean, they're taking an object home, but I think what we're selling is a story and a relationship. And if we're selling a story and a relationship, that is only mine. I'm not competing with anyone else, right? Because my story is only my story. And that relationship I'm building with my audience it's not transferable to another artist, right? And I think to think of us just selling objects commodifies artwork, right? Thankfully, we're not just selling objects, because if we were just selling objects, then we would be competing with Bed Bath & Beyond and Target and all of that. We're not selling objects. We're selling relationships. We're selling stories. We're selling this interaction that we're having.
We're selling inspiration.
Yeah.
So like a collector, likes the way a piece of art looks, and then it starts to grow on them. But then once they hear more about the artist and the story behind it, then when they walk by it in their everyday life, they feel inspired by that piece and what it represents to them.
Absolutely. I think of the piece as almost like an artifact of that interaction.
Cool.
Right?
I love that.
It's something that they're taking home with them from this experience that they had at the show, the experience they had with us, and that whole interaction that they had. I think that it's really been apparent in this last year, because I think that that's why we weren't seeing success, or very much success, on these online platforms. Right? Because some of them that are just a shop, right, is selling the art just as a commodity, just as an object. And we can't compete there. We can't compete on price, all of these things, if we try to sell as commodity. So thankfully, that's not what we're doing, and not what art festivals are.
Right. Well, kind of circling back to the idea of thinking about the business side of things, it seems like as a group, as artists, we connect to our work and the creation of our work, that we identify ourselves very closely to what we're creating. It's very personal to us. And sometimes the business side of things, there's like a romance to, I'm a true artist. I don't think about the business side of things. That's going to have to work itself out. Or the idea that I'll be the starving artist, and that means I create really good work. Is it, could we discuss a little bit that myth of the starving artist and about being a successful entrepreneur?
So the first thing I'd do to challenge that myth is to ask where it came from and who it benefits.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's a benefit to the artist. And I don't think it's a benefit to the art. So who stands to gain from us holding on to that myth? I think if we really want to honor our work, it is our responsibility to figure out how to get it out into the world. And that necessarily takes an eye on the business side. So I think oftentimes we wear it like a cape, right? Of this idea of poverty as moral virtue for the artist.
That's what I've gotten too from that whole statement.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not the artist that benefits from wearing that cape. And the more I dig into working with artists and the broader economy, the more I see that there are others that benefit from us wearing that cape. So we need to put that cape down and understand to really honor our work is to get it out into the world.
So when you say other people benefit, are you saying other industry or other sources of revenue? They can kind of like, by having us to the sideline, they have a captive audience to themselves?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I think when there's not parity, financial parity between artists and other industries, then we can be used for others' economic benefit, right? And so I'm looking quite a lot into the real estate market, a variety of ways that it keeps us in a position that isn't empowering, right? And we willingly do that to ourselves as well. Artists also like to say that they're not good business people. And I think it's kind of a misunderstanding about what business or what entrepreneurship is, because business and entrepreneurship really is problem solving. Right. And problem solving in new and creative ways. And that is exactly what we do as artists. We are amazing problem solvers. And so if we deploy that same skill towards the art side, artists can be amazingly brilliant business people. It might not look like other conventional businesses, right? Yeah. But that's not the measure of being a good business person.
Yeah. It is something that grows on itself. I remember when I first started in the business of being an artist, I didn't think too much of myself as being somebody who could build equipment, because there's a lot of equipment involved in building a glass studio, for example. And you know what? It started as small as me fixing a dishwasher, in my house. And then that confidence built, and I changed my identity from being someone who can't do it for myself, like a baby learning to walk, and step after step to being able to build my own furnaces, manage my own studio without having to hire somebody to do it for me. And so we do have the skills. It just is a learning process and acknowledging that we can learn.
Yeah. And most entrepreneurs, true entrepreneurs, are folks with an idea or something that they want to deliver to the world. They're not actually inherently good at business either. Yeah. One of the differences is that sometimes they have larger financial margins, so they can get a little more help, right? But so most entrepreneurs, they're not doing all these things necessarily for themselves. They're outsourcing, they're using technology. And we know that those are things as artists that we can do to make our businesses thrive as well.
So they're like the visionary behind it.
Yes.
And then they outsource the details.
Yes.
You figure it out for me, and my idea will take off.
Right.
And we can do that in our aspect.
Right. You have to have enough understanding of it to be able to get the right people around you, to ask the right questions, to figure out how to source the help that you need. But there's actually an amazing there's amazing resources out there for small business owners. And a lot of successful entrepreneurs have figured out how to tap into those resources. And a lot of artists don't, because they don't see themselves with that lens of entrepreneur, they don't even go seeking those resources. But there's most communities have got really great resources for small business owners and entrepreneurs that artists can tap into to get help.
You've told me that you consider yourself fluent in 2 languages. You're fluent in the native tongue of artist, and you're fluent in the language from the business world. How do you help artists bridge the gap between seeing their value between their art and being good for the community?
that is the number one place that artists have to start, is recognizing how valuable they are to the community, that they're not this isolated person or studio within their community, but they actually have value, and not wait for others to confer that value onto us. So thinking about what we're contributing to the community, it starts with our understanding of that.
Well, something you've said before that struck me as like revolutionary to think of it this way. I've always been able to say, well, arts is important to the community for its cultural sake, but you are actually teaching about how important it is for an economic and community building sake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's harder to demonstrate in numbers the economic contribution that individual artists are making to the community. But the reason that it's hard is that a lot of times those numbers get packaged into the numbers of a larger thing, right? So for instance, a festival would say what their contribution is to the, or what the arts contribution is to a community. But a festival is a collection of artists. The arts are a collection of artists. So a lot of times that individual artist contribution gets hidden within the whole. So it is more difficult to put numbers on it. But one of the things that I like to challenge both artists and communities that I'm working with to think about is every time they talk about the value of the arts, and you'll see them, they're all writing about it. They're all talking about it right now, right? Mm-hmm. The arts are the economic engine of the community, all of these sorts of things, is to replace that word arts with artist, because there aren't any arts without artists, right?
Right.
But we've separated the person from the industry, right? And so I think just conceptually to always think of like the artists. What are the artists contributing? The symphony is a collection of artists, but we talk about them like a monolith, right? And so then it's hard to recognize the individual contribution.
Right. By employing artists and them earning a paycheck, they then become contributors to the overall economy.
100%. Yes, absolutely.
Well, how have you also used this interpreter skill that you have to inform business and industry how valuable artists are and create programs and financing for artists so that they can continue to produce their work and expand their business?
Well, I think just like we were talking about, that artists often don't see behind the curtain of other artists' practices. If we don't understand the way other artists are making a living, certainly traditional business people don't understand the way artists are making a living or what they're contributing. And so in large part, because I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of artists, I can bring those stories to the table with business people and help them understand what an art practice looks like. And I can find the analog with other businesses and demonstrate it in that way. So as an example, I helped start the first micro-lending program built specifically for artists in Kansas City. And I had an audience with the city, and I'm at the table with the city manager. It sounds crazy to us, but he asked with zero irony, well, what do artists need money for? But it was an honest question. Right? Like he didn't understand. And so someone from the lender was there, and I said, well, tell me about the last loan that you made. And they started referencing a plumber that needed some equipment that they were renting every time they needed it because they didn't have the capital to get it. And I said, well, that's my musicians that rent a PA every time they have a gig because they don't have the capital to ever buy that. And so if we could help them buy that, then they would make it back. Give me another. And so then we just kept going like that. Give me another example of a loan you've made. And so it's really like pulling back the curtain on what does an art practice look like? Who are artists, right? They're not other. they're your neighbor or someone in your neighborhood, all of that. Just really, again, making them human. Like, it's not arts. These are artists. These are people that live in your neighborhood that buy a house, pay a mortgage and send their kids to college. And of course, they're contributing to the community just like everyone else. Right?
One of the things that has jumped out at me this year is the rug got pulled out from under all of us. The government, the Small Business Administration, they had to start deciding, well, how are we going to keep this whole country from collapsing economically? And so traditional businesses that fall under corporate structures like a partnership or an S Corp or C Corp, it's real clear. I mean, the business is separate from the individual and their profits are very clear. Their income is clear, what the employees are getting paid. The owner, who is an employee of the company, it's very clear what they get paid. It was easy in that situation to say, this is how we're going to fund you to keep you going for the next 6 months. Well, us independent artists, it was a very confusing situation because we are married. Our individual is married with our business. We're disregarded entities. We're not separate from our business. The traditional businesses don't understand or know what to do with us. And that has left us kind of at a disadvantage this year.
In some ways, we can thank Uber drivers.
Okay.
For calling some attention to this idea of the sole proprietor. Like, there's more and more people working as sole proprietors than ever before. We have some other industries to thank for bringing some attention to that, even for us to be able to get the help.
To get some help, yeah. Before this last year, I never heard the term gig worker, but that kind of became the thing that allowed funding and financing to come our way.
Right, exactly. And we are the original gig workers.
Yeah.
Like, musicians are the original gig workers, right? But now there are lots of gig workers, right? Including Uber drivers or Postmates, all of these different Instacart shoppers. But even before this, there were more and more because corporations are letting go of their full-time folks, right? So they're employing more gig workers. Looking outside just our industry for examples in all kinds of ways helps us define a path for ourselves, right? And how they're handling it. As artists, we like to think of ourselves as outside the norm, but there's more and more people working like this now. And so I think we're going to have a larger seat at the table because of that. And understanding who we have things in common with is important. I teach a lot of financial literacy workshops. And one of the things that I say is we actually can't have it both ways, right? Okay. We can't receive the benefit of writing off everything and at the same time say, but I should be able to qualify for a mortgage, or I should be able to, we have to make some decisions about how we want to participate in the economy. And these are would you rather decisions, right?
If we make the bottom line of our business be just the bare minimum so that we can, and I'm not saying people cheating. I'm just, and I'm not saying don't take write-offs and don't, have it be legitimate. But if the goal of your business is to have a low tax liability, then you're setting yourself up for not being able to get funding for yourself because you have to show a history of being a revenue generating enterprise.
Right.
And once businesses become profitable, most tax professionals will shuffle them into a corporate structure so that they are protected from liability, so that they can have different tax liabilities, show profit, be able to build credit rating. And being a sole proprietor tends to limit us in that regards and takes away our power a little bit.
Although knowing that most of them do push artists into LLCs, we don't actually push most artists into LLCs. And one of the reasons is because most artists don't receive the protection that they believe they're receiving from it, because most of them don't keep a clean enough delineation between their business books and their personal books. They commingle money. And as soon as you commingle money, it means that you've lost the liability protection. And most artists don't have enough liquid assets to keep them separate.
My accountant had recommended that we form a state entity, LLC. So we're not talking about where I incorporate into a C Corp, S Corp, anything, or partnership, but it is filing the paperwork. With our state, it runs a couple $100 maybe. And then you can add the LLC at the end of your sole proprietorship, and that is supposed to wall you off from your business liability. Are you saying that unless you are super clean with this is a Sigworth Glass bank account and a personal bank account or a Sigworth Glass credit card, unless all of those accounts are crystal clear and you only spend appropriately from those accounts, then you kind of are throwing away that protection?
100%. It's called piercing the corporate veil. So as soon as money comes back and forth, then they will say, this LLC is really just a shell to protect them from liability, and they don't actually have that liability protection.
Yeah.
So then lots of folks think that they do, but most artists I know don't keep clean enough books to actually get the benefit that they think that they're getting.
That term you used, piercing the corporate veil, that's great. My dad was a tax professional, and he did our taxes since the beginning of our business. And he said, here's the deal, describing exactly what you said, so we wouldn't ever have any problems. And if you want to remain protected, you need to do what you're saying about keeping your accounts really clean.
Yeah, so there's two aspects of the LLC or corporate structure, right? There's the legal liability aspect and the tax liability aspect. And so sometimes you'll get advice from a tax professional around what kind of legal liability protection it will give you, and they're not really qualified, right? And vice versa. An attorney will tell you for the tax benefit. And these are actually two distinctly different things. And so from while it might make sense on the tax side, then you might not be getting the legal protection, and vice versa. So there's two sides of it. My best girlfriend is an attorney that did business structure for small creative entrepreneurs for years, and and my mother's a CPA, like I said. So I've got both of them in my ears. And so I think, like everything else, understanding exactly why you're doing it. It's your job to be an expert at your business.
Keep asking the whys. And you're saying that in this situation that we're talking about, the two people to talk to are your lawyer for personal liability and business liability, and your accountant for tax liability and books. And those are the people to take the advice from, and not off of us podcast conversationalists.
Right. 100%. Yeah. It's about asking, and it's about, what we can help you with is knowing the questions to ask or the things to think about when you begin that conversation. And I think that there's another, and I don't know what this number is because it has changed, and it changes as the tax code changes, but there is a definable number or number range where if your profit begins to tip over that point, then it does make sense to go even to a larger structure, S Corp, probably. And there's a number there that is, if you're making over X amount. And so doing some research on that.
Knowing where the cliff is, you fall off the cliff and then you're making more means you're earning less. So you need to know where that line is.
One thing about being an LLC is it's a little bit like driving in the middle lane, in that if you don't know if you're going to make a right-hand turn or a left-hand turn, if you don't know if you're going to be a sole proprietor or an S Corp, you drive in that middle lane, and then it gives you some flexibility to make that decision. So if you're getting close to the cliff, then you probably want to be driving in the middle lane so that you can make an adjustment either direction. Because sometimes we don't know what the balance of the year is going to look like, right? If we're getting close, maybe you have some big project come through in November or December, and that would still give you time to take the left into the S Corp. So that's another benefit of the LLC that is not about liability, it's about flexibility. One of the things I really think about a lot in a lot of the training that I do is us making mindful decisions about, and this is what I mean about being proactive, right? Is about making decisions about this. I've decided that I'm going to operate like this. Therefore, here's the consequences or the decisions of that.
There's so many potential goals out there for the individual to have, and when you work across so many disciplines, a musician is going to have a different goal than a visual artist.
And until someone determines where their own goals are, no one can help them set a path, right? It reminds me of this. There's an Alice in Wonderland quote where Alice is coming down the path and she comes across the Cheshire Cat. And she says, well, what path do I take? And the Cheshire Cat says, well, where do you want to go? And she says, well, I don't know. And he says, well, then it doesn't matter which path. Right. And it's kind of like that.
That's being reactive.
Right. It's once you define where you want to go, there is a path and someone can help you find your way to that path. But until you define that spot out there, no one can help you define that path. So all of the work that I do starts with artists defining their goals, their both short-term and long-term goals. And then we start researching and finding the path to get from A to B. But you've got to know, you can't put in Google, give me directions, into Google Maps.
It says where? Address maybe, right. Name of the business.
Right. But you actually have to know both things. You've got to know where you are and where you want to go. And then we can define a path from here to there.
When I talked to you on the phone before the interview, you had mentioned to me about an artist identifying what they want, and then they will have the opportunity come to them. And my first reaction to you, which I'm laughing about now, was, is that kind of like The Secret? I want a red bike and a red bike will appear. And you're like, kind of, not really. Do you want to set the record straight on that one?
Sure. So, one of the places that I've identified that I'm heading, and I've been heading for a few years now, is towards large public art. So large scale work in public space. And,
awesome.
I had lots of steps to go from the small pieces in my booth to being able to achieve that, right? I didn't quite have the credentials. I mean, I'm working my way there. But I've done a couple of large pieces and I'm actively looking for those opportunities. And so I was at a show in Bend, Art in the High Desert, and I had sold a piece to someone, and just in the course of conversation, asking him what he was up to. And he's a developer and he was building hotels at the moment. And the last big public piece I had done was on the exterior of a Hilton hotel here in Kansas City. And so I was able to then engage in this conversation. I'm working with the Hilton Hotel right now. We're doing this. And he was interested then in figuring out how he could incorporate art into the exterior design of his buildings. And now we're having that conversation. If I didn't know that that's where I'm heading, I might have still had that conversation and he might have told me what he was doing. And I would have been like, that's nice, have a nice day, right? But instead, we were able to take that conversation in a different direction. We encounter so many people in our booths that there's a lot of opportunities that are walking in and right back out of our booth besides just selling them. I mean, that's kind of a short-sighted view of it, right? To just think of the only thing we're there to do is to sell this thing off our wall.
We have done 7 major installations in our career. And the first one we almost didn't take seriously. And it was at an art show. It was an architect coming into our booth. We make these sculptural glass orbs. He walks in, he says, oh my God, I've been looking for these all my life. And sometimes people use hyperbole like that and you just kind of blow it off. Well, he was an architect and he says, I am constructing a children's hospital and there's a healing garden and I had this idea for glass marbles, but I've never seen anything. And our eyes opened a little bit wider and the negotiations started. And it was at that point that I realized Renee and I needed to create something that was big enough in scale, but not obviously, we can't create a public works space in a 10 by 10 booth. And so we built these towers, and from that came installation of columns because they could visualize what we would do with it. So it opens up the conversation. You have to give them something that will have them step into the idea.
Yeah, I really, really like that. And that's a perfect example of being proactive, right? Like recognizing that there was an opportunity and then proactively deciding, what can I do in my booth to further me towards this goal, right? That's an exact scenario that I'm talking about. For this year, I now finally have enough of these large pieces in my portfolio, like the Hilton 140 feet by 10 feet. So large
Wow, yeah.
pieces that we're printing a book to have in my booth.
To have like on a table or an easel opened up so they can kind of flip through and see.
So that they can visualize what it can look like at this large scale. And so I think, it's one of the exciting things about festivals is that while we're there to sell work, there's other opportunities that we can find while we're there. We have contact with so many people that once we know what it is that we're looking for, the other thing that I'd really encourage people to think about is like, what other goals do they have for the weekend besides sales at the end of the day, right? Are they just measuring success by what the number is on the end of the day, Sunday? What other goals do they have? Because then I think, while clearly we all need to make money, then I think it also, you can make something out of a show even when sales might not be walking in or out of the booth.
My interview that I had with Marjolin Vanderhart a few weeks ago, she said the value of a show to her is that it's lead generation. It's qualified buyers and lead generation. And if we show up, put our work out, and sit in our director's chair across the street and not engage, then our lead generation is just going to walk on by.
100%. It was actually, I had changed accountants. This is years ago, maybe 15 years ago. I changed accountants, and he said, I'm going to put all of the festivals, don't mistake this for accounting advice, but my accountant told me.
This is an anecdotal.
Right, is that I'm going to put this, really festivals they're marketing. It completely changed the way I looked at a festival, that while I am making sales there, really it is a marketing platform and way, way beyond what happens over the course of those 3 days. And if I'm not looking at it that way, if I'm just getting in my van and going to the next show without following up with people, all of those things, then I'm leaving a lot on the table. And I've given a lot of workshops, including at ZAP conferences around called The Growth Lies in the Maybes. And for any business, that's actually where you increase profit, is those leads, those maybes, because you've already sunk all your cost into doing the show. So you've already driven yourself there. You've already paid for your booth. If you can increase the sales by following up with people, by making some calls, that's profit because you've already put the money into doing the show.
Along with the concept of being proactive, like you've mentioned, is every artist should have a proactive plan for when those conversations happen. That it shouldn't be like, this never happens to me. I've got to quick jot this down on a little slip of paper and maybe I'll get back to them later or hope I don't lose it. It needs to be a way that presents to the collector or to the potential large scale buyer that this happens all the time. That this is what they do. They talk to people, they take down notes, they get back to me later. That it isn't all just a cash and carry business. We need to attend to that, but then we also have to have a system in place that we can have lead generation and continue follow-up.
That is one of the differentiators between folks that made it through this last year in better shape or didn't, is how many of those warm leads that did you have that you could go back to. Right. I know that's what got me, or that's one of the things that got me through the last year, is that I had enough of those warm leads that had been developed over the last few years that then helped support us through the last year.
I've heard that from a lot of artists. I agree 100% on that they said, thank God for those projects that were in the talks, because they sealed the deals on them.
And I think, not just, it's all of those leads, all of that is like insurance, not just against a pandemic, but, I broke my arm in 2019. Right. And so, all kinds of things can befall us, or our family could have an emergency where we can't make it to festivals, or we don't get into festivals that happens. You just
there's so many pitfalls with traveling across country, car accidents,
right? All of these things, that this is like having insurance in the bank, to have these leads and to know how to proactively activate them.
We do need to plan for worst case scenario situations so that we are protected and that we do know how to navigate our way through.
Another myth that maybe needs to be overcome is that there's this idea that we've arrived as an artist when we're making 100% of our income selling our artwork, or we've arrived, we're successful, we're professional artists when we're making 100% of our income selling at festivals or whatever. But that's a very vulnerable position. That's like setting our life on a tabletop that's only got one leg under it. And if that leg gets kicked out from underneath us, then we're in trouble, right? And what we know about most artists with sustainable careers is that they have multiple income streams. They have multiple revenue streams that are supporting that tabletop. It's like having multiple legs under the table.
Or multiple funnels, I know, like you've talked about in the past, is having broad, open-mouthed funnels that generates, catching the fish, so to speak, and then it narrows it down. So you shouldn't go by one. You're saying you need to diversify. So if one of those legs get knocked out from under you, you've got these other two to keep revenue coming in.
So I think figuring out what those might be is an important proactive step that we can do to ensure that we're not in trouble again if something should happen. That's what we've been seeing across all disciplines, right? With musicians, with actors. The ones that are really, really struggling the most are ones that only relied completely on that revenue stream. And people feel like if they've got other revenue streams, they're somehow not doing it right. Well, I thought that before I started doing this work. And now it's like, no, that actually is the more stable place. And not just from a financial standpoint, but I think it also helps creatively. Because if your work is your only income funnel, it also is like the golden handcuffs, because it's really hard to take the risk to create new work that you're not sure will be successful if that's the only leg under your table. And
that's a good point.
We can all think about people at festivals that we've seen their work stagnate. They're not creating new work. And I think in some ways it's because it's too risky too, because that's the only funnel. And so we can talk about it from an economic standpoint, but I'd say arguably it's even more important from a creative standpoint to have more funnels so that you can afford to experiment and take risks.
Well, one of the funnels that you've developed that kind of came out of the pandemic was creating this entertainment and sales platform on YouTube, and it's called the Seesaw Project. Can you talk about that?
We had a lot of fun. So this is a project that I put together with Kina Crow and Beth Bajarski. Kina is a mixed media artist that lives just outside of Pittsburgh, and Beth is a painter in Milwaukee. They're very, very good dear friends of mine, but also I had done a goal-setting retreat with 6 artists in 2019. We rented a house and we worked through goals together. And so like I mentioned, now we became this good peer group that are champions for one another moving towards our goals. So we were invested in one another's success in a different way. And when the pandemic hit, we started talking about what we were going to do. And the way I mentor like a petulant 3-year-old. I just ask why? And so we're on a Zoom call and we're saying, well, why do we do shows? Why do we do festivals? And we just started digging into this question of why do we do festivals? Why Why festivals over galleries? Why this over that? Why is this our chosen way to sell our work? And what are our favorite things about doing festivals that we're going to be missing this year? And, some of it included, seeing our fellow artists' new work. Like that's one of my favorite things of going to a festival and running to my friends' booths to see their newest painting.
It's inspirational. It fuels our own work.
Right. What else? We, dinner and drinks afterwards. One of our favorite parts.
That's
right?
a given.
Right? That's a given, right? But putting it...
I bet that happened on that retreat of yours. I bet there was some dinner and drinks on that retreat.
Right. We were in New Orleans, no less. So a fair amount of dinner and drinks and music, which was perfect, because then it was, why are we even digging into this business side so hard? Oh, yeah, because we love it. We love to be experiencing the art. But so we made a list of why do we do festivals? And, I have to tell you that, sales of artwork was somewhere on the list, but it wasn't the entirety of the list. And so taking that list, we started just thinking of, well, can we build something? What would it look like to build something that met all of these objectives? That were, seeing our friends' new artwork and touching base with our friends, keeping us moving forward through the pandemic, having dialogue with collectors, right? Why do we do festivals instead of putting it off at a gallery? Because we want to have that interaction with the collector was one of the things we identified. Anyway, so we built the Seesaw Project, and I will say it met many of those objectives. And so it was the three of us visiting online, talking about what was up in the studio, but then sharing our latest work and then having guest artists come on.
I'll just clarify for people who haven't seen it, and this is the first time they're hearing about it. So the three of you are co-anchors to a video style show, interaction, talking about your work, sharing work of friends that you like, having some humor, interaction. It's super relatable, and it's just a really, really fun platform to connect with artists and connect with buyers. Buyers can actually see the new things you're working on in the studio, and you get to know your personalities. It's just, there's so much fun about it. It's just great.
Thanks. In addition to digging into why we do festivals and can we make something that has all of those elements, because I work so closely with artists in other disciplines, we were taking a lot of cues from musicians and my husband's a musician. A lot of our musician friends were starting to do online shows. But then I did a webinar series about the CARES Act in the spring and did a round table. And one of the musicians who I admire a lot, a musician named Bo Bledsoe, he said, let's not try to just recreate the live experience. Let's not just try to recreate our festival booth, for instance, online. What are the advantages that we can tap into of this media that we couldn't have otherwise? And so we started having studio tours as part of that as well, which like they never get that peak when they're in the booth, right? So it's like, what can we add? Because if we just try to make it what we were doing live, then it's going to fall short, right? Because it's never going to be the experience of standing in the street. So let's not try to make it the experience of standing in the street.
Let's not just set up a booth in our studio and then walk through it as if we're trying to do the same model. The sky's the limit when it comes to this platform. So let's see what's beneficial about this platform and just run with it.
Yeah, exactly. Like let's capitalize on this new thing and not just try to recreate. In fact, we were calling it, let's not make fake meat, right? So, when you have a fake burger or a veggie burger. It's like, it might be very, very satisfying to have that veggie burger, unless you think that you're about to bite into a real burger. Right? And you're like, oh, that's not a burger at all. Right? It's very good on its own, unless you're expecting it to be a burger. So.
The three of you gel so well together. I mean, I know you're friends, but you all three bring something different to the table. I just really applaud your efforts on that. You guys did a great job on that.
Thank you. The listeners might guess I am the nerdy one.
You know what, Chris? You had the
nerdy.
You had the
one.
funniest line. I don't remember if it was episode 2 or 3, and you're like, nerd alert, nerd alert.
It's true. It's true. I can own it. That's a cape I will wear. The nerd cape. Starving artist I put down some time ago. But nerd I will proudly wear.
Well, I am on board with the passionate pragmatist. I tell you, that's going to be the way to go for me.
I'm looking forward to this being just the first of many conversations that we're going to have, and looking forward to seeing what you and Will do and where this goes, and really anxious to help in any way that I can to help y'all figure out a way down this path.
We're building partnerships all through the industry here. But before we wrap, I do want to give you a chance to plug your wonderful husband Kyle's work and talk about what he does.
Fantastic. Yeah. So all of the work that I do in the studio, I couldn't do by myself. I've got an amazing partner, Kyle Dahlquist, who is an artist himself. He is a musician of multi-talents, plays every instrument he can get his hands on. And he fortunately just was able to go back to playing his first live gig last weekend.
Oh, so how exciting.
Really, really phenomenal to be in community with other people, outdoors and safe, of course, but in community with other people listening and dancing to live music.
Awesome.
And so that is a big, big part of our life. And he's really the talent in the family. So thanks for giving a shout out to Kyle.
Absolutely. Well, you know, when Renee and I were next to you guys, you're just such generous, kind, wonderful people. I was really great that we made that first connection, and I just, I miss you guys, and I just wish you all the best, and look forward to seeing you down the road at the next show somewhere.
Thanks. Or if it's maybe before that, we'll see one another on a screen. Coming to a screen near you.
I'm seeing so many people on screens nowadays, I tell you.
Yeah. The interesting thing about both Seesaw and all of the teaching I've done for the last year is I oddly actually feel more connected in community than I did before. And
that's great.
It's really changed my idea of community from being those I'm in proximity with. Again, this goes to intentionality. Right?
Yeah.
Just the folks that I'm in proximity with versus being proactive about building community with people across the country, not just because I happen to run into them at a show, but because we really are pulling in the same direction and being intentional about getting together.
Nice. Thanks again. This was so much fun. I enjoyed this hour so much with you. And all right, my friend, till we meet again.
Okay. All right.
Man, I really enjoyed that talk that you had with Chris. Again, it was soothing. It was inspirational. It was it builds us up and it gives us a place to go. So thanks for talking to her.
Yeah. You bet. I'm all about table legs. We're getting more table legs underneath of us, get us some more stability. We're not going to have COVID that knocked us out at the knees happen again. We're going to have lots of different ways to keep the wheels on the cart.
This conversation you had with her was more of a starting point for a lot of people, I feel like. If Marjolin was the fire that we all needed lit under us, then Chris Dahlquist is the soothing, you can do it voice of encouragement that we all needed, right?
Yeah.
Chris, thank you so much for sitting down with Douglas. It makes a really interesting talk.
Well, as we wrap this episode, I'm getting emotional even just starting to think about it. This has been a rough week for all of us. We've lost a giant in our art fair community. Russell Yerk has passed away.
He was such a nice man, such a kind man. I remember going through a tough patch in my life and being near him at a show down in Florida, and the kind words he had for me. He'd been through a lot himself, and he just was there for me when I needed a friend, and he was there for so many of us when we did. So I'm getting emotional myself. It's a huge loss.
It is. The thing that everybody says about him, and to come back to what you said earlier about building each other up, this guy he did that in spades. He walked up to my booth at Fort Myers a couple years ago when we first met him, and he was so kind and so complimentary. And I got to know him, and I went for the first time, was exposed to his work, and I was completely blown away by what he does. It's unfathomable to me how he's able to do what he does.
Yeah, he was one of the rock stars in our industry. He's so talented and so giving, but he did a similar thing. I ran into him at the bowling alley at Winter Park, and he was talking about my work and a new piece that I had. And it was, sometimes you feel like you create this work in a vacuum and that your peers don't see it. And when you get those kind words from somebody that's that talented, it meant a lot to me. And I feel like going forward, there's no way to fill the gap, but we're all going to kind of have to step up and be maybe a little bit more kind. That's how I feel.
I agree. I sometimes am afraid to say to another artist, hey, I like what you're doing here. I don't know why. Maybe it's too vulnerable. Maybe it's too whatever, but I'm going to take a lesson from him and really share praise when I'm feeling it and not hold back on that, because he is a man who shared the love, and he has a lot of love coming back at him right now.
Definitely. And my heart goes out to his family. I can't imagine the loss there. I know his son has been online and seen a lot of the outpouring of emotion. He has had friends from coast to coast. We'd go down. I know he focused mostly in Florida, but artists coming from all over the country would go down and kind of soak up that kindness. So definitely heart goes out to everyone.
So many artists have written to me telling me their experience, saying in Winter Park that he was so happy to be back with his tribe. I've had experiences shared where they say their last moments of him are they were dancing, there was happiness being shared, and it's ironic that, the following week he passes. So at least we have those memories of him, and his beautiful work will live on forever.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Douglas. Thanks for the kind words. Thanks for the great interview with Chris Dahlquist. We'll see everybody next time.
All right. Bye, Will.
This podcast has been brought to you by the National Association of Independent Artists. The website is naiaartists.org.
And while you're at it, check out Will's website at willarmstrongart.com and my website at sigworthglass.com.
And remember to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when we release new episodes.